After a 28-year investment banking career overseas, he comes home to what he sees as an exciting time in the Philippines, on the cusp of significant growth in digital payments, infrastructure, and climate transition. With us and thought leaders, please welcome the CEO of Standard Chartered Philippines, Mike Samson. Good to have you with us, Mike.
Hello, Kathy. Thank you
Welcome
for
to the
having me.
program, and
Thank you
belated
for.
congratulations.
Thank you.
It's been quite a quick 6 months, was
It's
it?
been six
Into the
months.
job here in Manila.
Exactly.
How
I,
does
I
it feel
arrived
like?
on the 1st of December, and it's been running ever since. But I was away for 27 years,
You
actually.
have, in
And
fact,
this is
28 years.
28 years. It's quite a homecoming for me to my homeland.
And that homecoming, 6 months on, the reverse culture shock. I
Yeah.
mean, how's that coming along? You know, I've done 15 years myself overseas in Hong Kong and Tokyo, and I came home for good.
Well, most of my time abroad was spent in Singapore and then a couple of years in Australia. Each had their own cultures, and I think Singapore, amongst the ASEAN nations, is possibly the most Western leaning in terms of how things are, the pace at which things are done, the ease at which things are done, and I think that would be not to say the culture shock, but the adjustment of when you should expect things to happen and how quickly should they happen and how much patience you should allocate to a task or a process, and also to be sensitive around knowing that for all of the best intentions you really do have to allocate a larger amount of time.
I thought we were the most westernized when you said Western. I mean, you got the bars, the restaurants, they're all like,
English.
very Americanized.
Yeah.
But what is it, in fact, in the culture that you're starting to grapple with and
Mm.
that you're coming around to kind of going around
Mm.
in order to get the job done?
Mm. I think the strength of a Filipino coming back to the Philippines, having had an international experience, being part of the diaspora in a way, and then coming back. Part of the strength of that is that you can bring ideas, modes of working, ways of thinking that would immediately be accepted by our colleagues in the Philippines because they've seen it work elsewhere. But it is not being seen as foreign or something that you should reject because it's a Filipino who's coming back home that's saying it. So that's been the strength. That it's been a joy to rally the team in the Philippines. They have embraced me. I'm very thankful for that. On the other hand, right, what do you have to adjust with is in the Philippines we have a business environment which has a lot of conglomerates with a few set of families, and the families do own several verticals. They account for a large part of the market capitalization of the stock exchange. In that kind of context, where, for example, if you compare to Australia or to Singapore, where you have really diverse sets of clients, you have to be very, very mindful, very alert, very responsive to small or large requests because ultimately it will uh, filter to just a small group of clients, which you must serve with your utmost capacity. That's been the adjustment, really, to be very mindful, responsive, and to inculcate that in the team.
Speaking of being embraced by the team, it's such a joy to actually look at the website and see that 10 out of 12 in the management staff are women or identify
Yeah.
as a she or her. I mean, that's like outnumbering you and the
Yes,
chief
I'm actually ruining the
technology
average.
officer. Are you ruining the
Yeah, because
average?
because my predecessor Lynette Ortiz, who has been on your show before, was a woman, is a woman, and I think at that moment we were almost entirely women. And I think it's uh, it's very interesting for me to come back to a situation like that. But I can tell you, Kathy, that even in our other offices, sort of that diversity focus has been there for more than a decade. I don't think you get to set, for example, our country management team, as you've noted, is about 80% women. Our branch is 72% women, right, or identify as women. And in in that kind of with that kind of statistic, that doesn't happen overnight. That's culture. That is part of the best person for the job, the best person for to be promoted. It it's just part of it. We don't actually even think about gender anymore. Yeah, in those equations, we just think who's the best person. And let the cards fall where they are. And as you can see, it's 72% women in the branch, 80% in the country management team.
So what's it like having 10 women in the boardroom, outnumbering the two others, including yourself? When the decision making comes, what's it like working with a lot more women than everyone's used to?
I don't think it's that different in the sense that you're all colleagues, you're all bankers, you're all part of an old institution, 151 years in the Philippines. But I will say preparation, um, lead time, attention to detail is higher when you have more women on your team in general. And I don't want to have any sort of uh, overarching assumptions, but I have noticed that um, we do prepare much more thoroughly when there are more women on the team.
That's good to know
Mm.
because coming from Lynette's interview, I mean, she did say something about being prepared
Yeah,
all the time when she goes into
yeah,
meetings.
yeah,
That's what really made her a leader, and now she's with Land Bank.
yes,
Just speaking about the economy that
yeah,
you're coming back to, you mentioned it's an exciting time. The first quarter GDP for the Philippines
mm-hmm.
was at
Yeah,
5.7% in the
yes,
first quarter. That's
yes,
faster than
yes,
forecast.
yes,
5.5% in the previous. But we do have accelerating inflation,
yes,
higher interest rates,
yes,
presumably headwinds
yes,
for a bank seeking corporates
yes,
through loans. Well,
yes.
what's your feel about where all this is headed and how much of a risk are they?
Mm. So let's take a step back and maybe I'll answer your question. Great question, by the way, from a more broader perspective. I am coming from outside, coming home to the Philippines. At the government's target is 6 to 7%. I think we can now all agree that given the current momentum, we'll be on the lower end of that estimate of probably closer to 6%. We ourselves think it's going to be in that 5.9% range. Our own economists, and the World Bank is tacking around 5.8% as a predictor for the Philippines. At that level, we are actually the highest growing economy in ASEAN. Vietnam comes close at 5.7, but we're the highest. So I think a bit of context setting, we may miss our ambitious target of 6 to 7%, but nonetheless, that's still faster growing than all of our neighbors. The global average is 3%, so we're double that global average. Now, in terms of what needs to happen from now until the end of the year in order to make up the difference, so you're saying 5.7%, I think the government is essentially saying to hit that 6% mark, we now have to grow 6.1% every quarter. It's going to be a tough ask. I think there will be a lot of um, things that have to go right internally and externally for that to happen.
Such
But
as?
well, internally or externally, you need to activate that investment that the government is looking for. You said exciting time. We have the first sovereign wealth fund in the Philippines, Maharlika, and its job is to be a magnet for investment across 180 or so priority projects in infrastructure and beyond. I think there will be assets that the government owns that Maharlika will also perhaps sell to external investors. So not just what needs to be built, but what could be sold or what could be privatized is also there. So that's one. And as you know, Kathy, an investment, if you're building something or you're asking someone to buy something, it takes time. That is not a foreign exchange trade that you can execute overnight. So that needs to go right, but it will take time. The second thing that has to go right is the clear guidance from the central bank on monetary policy. Um, and I must say, Governor Remolon and his team are doing a great job of that. That will then stabilize the field and have investors understand what they should expect from the Philippines. Stability, whether high or low, clarity is what investors are looking for, and indeed domestic investors too. I think the third thing that needs to really happen is the activation of the capital markets in the Philippines. If you hear Governor Remolona speak, that's what he really wants to really encourage. He's like me, a diaspora coming home, right? He spent a lot of time at the Fed. And if you can see, the U.S. capital markets are the deepest in the world across every risk class, from AAA all the way to what we call high yield, which is, sub-investment grade. I think the governor is trying to spur, to the extent that he can, all of that growth. And if you put all of that cocktail together, we can make up some of that difference to get to that 6.1%. But a lot of things have to go right too.
And as you say, it's really a tough ask, and even a tougher ask if you consider the excessive heat. I mean, that's happening across the ASEAN.
Yeah.
We're not spared.
Yeah.
But what's really the complicating factor is that we've got these power outages
Mm.
with the red alerts,
Yes.
from the yellow to the red alerts that we have to deal with. It
Yes.
seems like a country that's bursting at its seams,
Yes.
wanting to expand further but cannot
Yes.
because of that infrastructure deficit.
Yes. Which is why I think Maharlika is just one of those things, right, where you really have to spur investment in the power sector, in the infrastructure sector, in ports, not just ports for trade, but ports to bring in LNG, in order to power in the electricity grid and so on. But coming back to the heat, right, we can't deny that this is a moment, and it's been so for the last 3-4 years. This is the moment where we can't deny the effects of the climate, which is exacerbating the natural flow of our planet. La Nina or El Nino, you'll have extreme weather. And it's all across. It's not just in the Philippines. We are experiencing record highs across ASEAN and around the globe. If you look at the data in the Copernicus Institute out of Europe, it's all across the world. Our share of emissions in the Philippines, according to Bloomberg data, is 0.43%, less than 0.5%. ASEAN as a whole, 5.18%. Indonesia is 1.9% of that 5.18%. So ASEAN, even if ASEAN sort of completely shifted into no fossil fuels, which is impossible, you're only handling a small proportion of the emissions. So what you really need is a planetary solution, is a unified solution. And you need patience, because it will take time to build and innovate towards all of those solutions.
You say it's impossible. I mean, what
Impossible
about the targets?
to just, we have targets.
2030,
Impossible
2040?
today. Impossible to just go cold turkey and move immediately. You have to transition. On certain days, California is almost 100% taking its power from renewable sources. So that it's not impossible in the sense that if you have innovation, you have political will, you have the economic incentives, it can happen. But it needs all those three.
I want to get back to investments. As you mentioned, it is really important to make an economy grow. I was just looking at the latest Philippine Statistics Authority data on committed foreign direct investments. This is just for the first quarter.
Yes.
It's experienced a sharp decline,
Yeah.
down by about 63.6%. And this is quite important because the figure represents the FDIs that have committed to the country's eco-zones. Now, you don't really in particular look at eco-zones, but it kind of gives you an idea of the bit of a temperature check, if you will, on how foreign investors feel about our country. What are you seeing on your side? Are they just as interested, or do they have issues investing in the Philippines?
We are actually, if I look at ASEAN, we are actually experiencing extreme interest in what MBM Diokno actually calls the VIP, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Philippines. Not by accident that these are also the three fastest growing economies in ASEAN. There's extreme interest. I think what we are measuring in the economic zones is important. And in a way, those are manufacturing hubs. Those are hubs where we have tax incentives. Those are hubs that are designed to attract foreign investment. But we are actually seeing significant interest in clean tech and renewables. We are seeing extreme interest in infrastructure. And we are also not measuring, shall we say, in that statistic, it's not measuring a sidecar statistic, which is how much financial investment is actually being directed at the Philippines. Very recently, we helped the Republic of the Philippines issue a 2 billion bond, a 10-year and a 25-year. The 25-year tranche was a sustainable, a green bond. And the use of that will be into sustainable uses. uh, BDO, uh, we were the lead arranger on BDO 63 billion peso sustainable bonds, the largest in ASEAN. Not just the largest corporate issuance in the Philippines, that's true, but it's the largest in ASEAN. That's almost a billion, $2, $1.2 billion of proceeds. Investors are going through there. Now, it's not being measured as a direct investor making an investment in an economic zone, but it is giving a prime pillar of the financial banking system like BDO all of the ammunition in order to channel that into green, green lending, green investments. So I think we have to see it holistically, not just in what's going into the economic zones, but also what is being raised by our Philippine corporates from the international capital markets. Our access has never been greater, I would say, in my opinion. I've covered the Philippines from overseas for many years. For example, did you know that our country has had an unbroken line of 14 straight upgrades? It's one of the few nations in the world that's had 14 straight ratings upgrades. That actually opens up the capital markets significantly. Can we do more? Of course, we can do more. Of course, we can do more. And I think the government is, aligning behind clean tech and infrastructure as the areas in which they want to use policy, incentives, tax breaks, and encouraging people like us, market participants, to drive investment into those two.
So, can we do more in terms of policy? Because when you come to look at the enabling policies, we have a lot working
We
in
do.
place. We have the Retail Trade Liberalization Act,
Yes.
that's one. Then we have the Public Services Act.
Yes.
And just 2 years ago, amendments
Yes.
were made to the Foreign
Yes.
Investment Act.
Yes. Uh, well, look, I'll give you. I'll answer your question tangentially first, right, and then directly. Let's take. So, I was in Australia before I came to the Philippines. Let's take one of the largest pension funds in Australia. It's called Australia Superannuation Fund, and superannuation funds are one of the largest investors in Australia. Their investment, they have about 180 billion Aussie dollars under management, and they're just one of 120 superannuation funds. Their investment horizon is already spoken for the next 2 years. What and they're investing about a billion a week of investing. In short, it takes a long time, especially for capital infrastructure investments, for the decision to be made and then to be deployed, right? So we can't be so impatient that just because we have passed the law, that's the first gateway. And that will be what will turn heads. That will be when we do our Philippine economic briefings. One of the first things I did in this role was to be with the government in APEC in San Francisco in October last year. We have to do those Philippine and tell the story. Uh, and investors will come, but it takes time for them to make that investment.
How much more time then?
Soon,
Before you see
you
soon.
you will
What
see
needs
you.
to change to make it quicker?
Um, let's let's look at renewables because we've been talking about it, right? I think you're seeing a lot of investors going into wind and solar. Uh, it takes time to build that. It takes time to so find the land, clear the land, change the land use from agrarian to power generation. It takes time to, if you're going to do offshore wind, you don't want to ruin coral beds when you anchor those turbines, right? And so it takes time to have consultancy with, uh, non-governmental organizations and environmental, concerned parties in those areas before you build. So all of that will take time. Then you have to build a transmission grid that will take power from the sea, undersea, and truck it into the national grid. That takes time. But I can tell you, the gestation period, construction of power facilities, grids, is about 9 months to 12 months. In renewable, if it's a gas-fired power plant, 3 years. There are many of these initiatives are already underway, and maybe one by one you'll see a bonanza of these announcements. Battery technology, storage. It's always been a problem with renewables. How do you store the power? Intermittency, right? At night, there's no sun, but if you stored some of the solar energy in sort of the new batteries, those are also being built in the Philippines. We know that we're parts can't tell you exactly what they are because they're still confidential, but they are in the process.
So can we take it to mean that a solution in maybe say Australia is going to be different here in the Philippines?
Yes.
So what then are you seeing
Yes.
could be that multi-solution when we talk about renewables
Yeah.
and in terms of sustainable financing?
Yeah. So clean technology and renewables is primarily a domestic solution, and it changes from country to country. For us and for Indonesia, we have a lot of geothermal because we're in the ring of fire. And so because of that, we use a lot of geothermal. Australia has a lot of desert. So solar will be a very big part of the renewable mix. But can you transport that solar energy from, let's say, a precinct in Darwin? They're building one of the largest solar fields in Darwin. That's 7 to 8,000 kilometers of subsea cable that you have to build. It's very hard. So it's going to be a domestic solution. And what made fossil fuels so effective is that you could take a gas molecule from a field in Saudi Arabia, put it in an LNG ship, and bring it to the Philippines without any loss of energy, right? That you can burn that molecule or you can transform that molecule into energy. It's not the same for renewable. You need a transmission grid, you need storage, and so on. So it's got to be a holistic solution, and it will vary from country to country.
And it also varies in terms of its linkages. Like my understanding is when we talk sustainable financing in the Philippines,
Yeah.
it's broader in context
Yeah.
because we link it to the UN Sustainable
Yes.
Development Goals.
Yes.
How different is this from the jurisdictions you've taken care
Mm.
of, for instance, in Australia? How does that differ, and where do we get that competitive advantage then? If you're seeing exciting times for the Philippines.
Well, look, we are actually in ASEAN leading the way because we are much further along on climate taxonomy. We're, I think, on the third passing of the paper, and very soon we will have a climate taxonomy. Why is that important? This was pioneered in the EU. I don't think the US is as into climate taxonomy, but climate taxonomy allows investors to discern, engage which of the investments, infrastructure, um, labeled in a sort of green way, are worthy of their investments because they want to make a difference. They want to move the needle just as we do. And getting to a climate taxonomy is the first principle there because it tells someone that there's in a way, a good housekeeping seal on each of these projects, that these are part of the UN and the EU's global taxonomy. It's aligned. And that means that just like a triple B rating on a bond, with Standard & Poor's and Moody's, it's aligned to that. That's why it's important. And we are leading the way. I can honestly tell you we're ahead. Indonesia is close behind us, but we are further ahead than they are.
But it's in its third reading, so where do we get that data? Because there is that huge gap when it comes to gathering the data and making clients aware where the money really lies and what the need is off the market when it comes to sustainable financing.
I think we do have paper-based, a lot of that data already, but you need third-party international experts to really opine and say, well, this data is solid. So that when you say, okay, now what is considered green in the Philippines is understood to be green by the UN and by the EU is the same data set. It will take time. We have the data, but it will also take experts to say, yes, that data is solid. And that cannot be rushed.
So what are you now working on with the data that you know and finding the opportunities, especially as you're also seeing a generational change that you're seeing as a leverage, as a lever and a competitive advantage.
So
that,
if you
that
look
the
at
Philippines has.
if you look at our sustainable within the investment bank, our focus in sustainability is actually in 4 areas. The first area is clean tech and renewables, which we have been speaking about quite a lot. The second and very important piece is the circular economy, waste to energy, recycling. Third piece is the electronic vehicle value chain. And the fourth is low carbon hydrogen. That's ammonia, that's ethanol, that's methanol. We have a wealth of ethanol. Why? We have a lot of sugarcane. So you could transform that sugarcane into sugar, into gin, or you can use it for jet fuel. And people are innovating, and we are trying to follow our clients in as they try and innovate into those other uses as ethanol as fuel. So if you look at those four, they really attempt to address the climate challenge, which is a generational challenge for us, in a holistic way, not just power generation, manufacturing, which is the circular economy. As you know, Cathy, today there is no other way to create steel than by using metallurgical coal. So what do? You get old buildings, you take the rebar, you recycle it. So you don't have to make new steel, you don't have to burn new coal. So circular economy is very important in manufacturing. And then transport. That's why electronic vehicles, the batteries that go into those electronic vehicles are very important. And then, of course, also related to transport, the kinds of fuels that you use, ethanol-based, methanol-based, ammonia. We used to use ammonia for fertilizer. Now we can use it for power generation.
In particular, with the Maharlika Investment Fund, you mentioned it earlier.
Well,
Have you had a chat with
I would
Joel
ask
Konsing?
Joel.
You have had the chat
We
with
have
him.
had. We are. First of all, he is the founder. This is the early days of our first sovereign wealth fund, and within the region, there are only two others. There's Temasek, and there is INA in Indonesia. So it's not like this is well trodden ground, but we have models. We have the Middle East. We have ARIA. So a sovereign wealth fund has a very special position because it channels the limited resources of any government towards a single purpose. And in this case, that purpose is to kickstart infrastructure across the entire, including digital infrastructure. That will include towers and data centers. Everything, uh, we are in build mode. This is a building site, as Joel always says. We are helping him in the early days because I think he's quite keen to have quick wins or early wins so that the public can see that even though this is just in its infancy, there are many effective ways that we could bring in the investor already. So maybe it's not building something that will take 3 years to build. That is the immediate announcement. Maybe it's selling something that is subscale, but you can attract an investor and it will transform that asset.
So where are you now with
I,
him
I
in
can't
terms of
say.
those quick wins?
I can't say.
But he did say, and it was a laundry list of sectors he wanted to invest
Well,
in.
the
He said
NEDA has
infrastructure, oil, gas power, agroforestry, tourism.
yeah,
That's a whole lot already.
that's a lot already. That is a lot already. But we are particularly, because you try to find the confluence of where your sectoral focus as a bank is versus a sovereign wealth fund like Maharlika. So for us, I think the maximum area that we can help the fund is through infrastructure, um, through the digital economy, and through potentially resources.
When we talk about these sectors and in terms of return on investment,
Yeah.
where do you think the biggest monetary and non-monetary return on investment would come from?
That's an amazing question. If I knew the answer to that, I might not be in a bank. I might actually be in that industry. I'll tell you that the economic incentives today, let's say for clean tech and renewables, are rapidly moving to a very high return on tangible investment. Before, it used to be almost a quixotic quest that you're doing it for the good of the planet. But now it's actually, if you look at California, that's actually where the incentives are. And therefore, it's very remunerative to do something like that. But everyone already knows the clean tech story. In fact, if you want to buy we are the leading advisor in ASEAN, actually Asia ex Japan, for all of the clean tech platforms. If you want to buy a solar platform today, we did this for a private equity and Shell. They bought a solar platform in Asia. The multiples you will pay are very high because it's so in demand, right? So, in short, everyone already knows that that's where returns can be garnered. And because this is a free market, when more money, more investment is pursuing something, the price increases and then the profits decrease. I think one of the unspoken or more unheralded parts is around waste to energy. What we used to throw away, rice husk, can we use that for energy, for biofuel, recycling? All of the, if you industrialize that and take all of the plastic waste and then turn it into something, we have seen companies, startups become very, very successful doing that. The electronic value chain, electronic vehicle value chain. Did you know that everyone knows that Indonesia is the largest deposit for nickel in the world? Philippines is the second largest. New Caledonia in the South Pacific is the third. So our nickel industry is barely coming out of out of that. Indonesia is already much further along. I think savvy investors are looking at nickel and copper in the country and they're saying, well, that's the next undiscovered country, and they are coming. They are speaking to us. They are coming, and then I would say last is around the um, services that are aligned to that transformation. There will be, let's take the digital economy, right? They, the data centers and the use of the data centers in the past, when it was only retail fulfillment, was X%. With generative AI, and as it becomes part of our daily life, and we don't even notice that we are using generative AI anymore, ChatGPT, all of these things, and even when you ask your phone to, you know, create an emoji for you, that's AI. That will increase data center requirement by about 50%, four times
But it will also increase the use of power because it's so power hungry. And we were just talking about the deficit in power here in this country. So how do we support that? The need for generative AI power technology in data centers. Where's
Well, we have to,
the
right?
transition there
I
to
think the questions, the
sustainability?
generational questions that are being asked of us today, we have to find the answer. And I think innovation is the answer. I'll give you an example, but perhaps not in the Philippines, right? So Singapore has put a moratorium on data centers in Singapore because they want all of the data centers to be built to secure their power from clean and renewable sources. But as I told you, we don't have a lot of undersea cables in ASEAN. So even if you have a solar precinct, let's say in Indonesia, it's very hard to move that power to Singapore. It's happening. They are building. Companies across the Strait of Johor are building. So what has happened? It has activated the Klang Valley in Malaysia, which is kind of near Singapore. That's where all the new data, because they have a lot of solar there, and in general they've also had to repurpose monoculture agriculture, which is palm oil. Again, another issue. They have retransformed it into forest because they have put a solar precinct there. So they, part of it has been reclaimed as normal forest, and part of it has been reused, repurposed into solar to, to power the data center. So one, we have to answer but it has unintended great benefits, which is that you tend to build, because that's the rule, you tend to build new renewable to power it. And it will reactivate as an area. So Singapore is saying, I'm saturated. So Malaysia has been a beneficiary of that.
I was just speaking with Assistant Governor Pia
Yeah.
Romantayag on this very same program, and we got talking about the differentiation between mitigation
Right.
and adaptation,
Right.
which really becomes interesting because when you look at statistics from the report of the Climate Policy Initiative, it
Yeah.
says globally, climate financing is significantly skewed toward mitigation rather than adaptation.
Mm.
And just transition, which you mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we need
Mm-hmm.
to get from fossil fuel to sustainably led renewable.
Yeah.
Just 98% of adaptation financing is coming from public actors. So
Mm.
there's a lot of opportunity there, but there is that gap
Mm.
of private financing.
Mm. These
What
are
is
statistics for the Philippines, right?
that's correct.
Yeah.
What would StanChart Philippines be doing to address that gap between mitigation and adaptation financing?
First of all, um, we are not going to be picky in terms of where we try and catalyze investment, because if it's making something emit less, which is mitigation, fly ash capture, fluidized bed coal, because it's already there, we will help people who want to make that investment to lower the emissions, right? But what about adaptation? What you're saying is new build, right? New things that are being, we are also financing that. So if for banks and our bank in general, we're catalysts. We don't presume to have the, the ideas. We're not the innovators, but we finance the innovators. I think if you cast your mind back to 15th century Florence, right? Um, when banking was invented, the Medici actually transformed the economy from agrarian, royalty-based, right, uh, lords owning lands, towards the merchant class, people in textiles, people in building. And that transformation created such a boom in wealth. It created a renaissance, right? Michelangelo, Leonardo, all of these artists were born out of the patronage of the Medici. So banks are catalysts. We move capital from the old economy. I won't say the old economy, but you know what I mean. That where the innovation is no longer required, or that we don't want that technology anymore, or that is a hyper emitting area. We don't want to invest or deepen anymore to catalyze that into all of the new investments. Can we advise and push people and accelerate those investments, those fundraisings? Yes, we can. And we have a very healthy transition advisory practice as well.
But how can you catalyze, putting your money where it should be for just transition? Because I was just looking at Mark Carney and what he said in The Economist. He's the UN Special
Yeah.
Envoy
Yeah.
for climate action. He just wrote this last year before the Conference of Parties 28 in Dubai.
COP28, yeah.
COP28.
Yeah.
He said clean energy investment must rise, so that's one part of the equation. But he said at the same time, the heavy emitters are caught in transition traps. Heavy emitters struggle to get financing to cut
Exactly.
emissions meaningfully
Exactly.
because the
They're cut off.
financiers
They're cut off.
are doing all renewables and not helping them cut back on emissions.
It's not even that. I think there's a more nuanced answer to that, right? So, like, take us, right? We will not finance, let's take coal. We will not finance any new coal power plant, nor any new uh, thermal coal mine. We just won't. And around oil and gas, we have similar um, policies. But what about what's the legacy, right? So this is where transition plans are very important, and that's where the nuance has to be there. Banks and the capital markets will not abandon companies with a very strong transition plan. Have we exited names, even in ASEAN, even in the Philippines, where the transition plan did not match what we felt was the climate ambition or our own sustainability statements? Yes, we have. But that's a very small part of our client base. In general, we have actually helped our clients in their transition. But transition takes time, Cathy. To not everyone can be like Ayala Corporation, where suddenly it's 92% renewable because they sold out of their coal. Those that are still in coal have to transition and have to invest and build. And as I said, that's a 2 to 3 year zone before they become more balanced.
But as a financial institution, you're also answerable to your
Of
shareholders and
course,
stakeholders and
of course,
regulators.
of
They
course,
want you to perform by absolute
of
emissions of
course,
credits.
of
And
course.
then we go back to that paper, that taxonomy paper
Yeah,
we were talking about. And yes,
yeah.
you look good on paper, but you're actually not
Mm,
diminishing the
mm,
emissions in reality,
mm.
in the world out there.
Uh,
How do you remove that gap
uh,
and really, you know, be accountable to
sure,
what you say on paper?
sure. I think there is also an element of policy. Let's take Singapore. Singapore taxes emitters that have 25,000 tons or more of carbon emissions. And you can only abate 5% of that taxable emission. You can only buy carbon credits enough for 5% of that. The rest, you will actually have to either decrease directly or keep paying the tax. So, policy is one part. The second part is that if you look at where investments are going, let's take the biggest, some of the biggest investors, I won't say all, but some of the biggest investors, let's take Shell, are actually people that, or companies that have had high emissions, but have raised the financing, have the innovative culture, have the, in a way, corporate conscience to invest aggressively in the transition. Either think about if we discover sustainable jet fuel, which is a holy grail within for airlines. Shell is at the forefront of developing that. We have to give them time. It doesn't come overnight. It's very, very rare that you have such a crisis of such extreme and present proportions, like the pandemic, that a vaccine can emerge within a year from the moment that it happened, because everything was at a dead stop. Is that kind of urgency needed for the climate problem? Yes. And are there 20, 30, 2,000, 200,000 initiatives around the world that are going on at the same time? Going, yes. So I would say hard to accept, but sometimes you have to wait for these technologies to be financeable and, um, workable, deliverable. Think about jet fuel that you prematurely put out there and a plane explodes. Then you have a different problem. Then you set yourself back a decade.
So, how long is it going to take time to see?
I'll,
Your business here in Asia accounts for about 80% of the total earnings of Stanchart. I've just seen
I'll,
your first quarter
yeah,
earnings,
yeah,
and they did pretty well
yeah,
because of the Asian investment banking division.
yes.
How is all this sustainable financing going to show up one day
Let's
because of
it,
sustainable
it, it,
financing?
it's not showing up. It's here. This investment is
It's
here.
reflected in your
I'll tell
investment
you.
banking earnings right
I'll
now.
tell you. Yeah, yeah. It, our investment banking unit is not just what we finance. It's also what we advise and what we help raise. In fact, what we help to raise in the capital markets is much larger by a factor of maybe 100 on what we actually directly lend. I'll tackle those three. In 10 years ago, there was no bank in the Philippines, for example, that had a climate taxonomy internally, no climate structural framework for which you could raise uh, green bonds. Now, almost every bank in the Philippines has a green framework. That's progress. That means that you will see, as we have seen, every month a green bond out of a Philippine issuer. Last week, 2 weeks ago, it was the Republic. Last month, it was BDO. There'll be more. I can't tell you who, but they're in our pipeline. We know that so many. That's progress. And those funds can only be labeled green as per the taxonomy and the structure if they are invested in sustainable investments. So what we raised, that's just a Philippine microcosm. Expand that to especially our Asia franchise. What about our advisory practice? As I said, we are helping people buy. So at some point, there are three categories of renewable investors. There are those that are startups. There are those that were very large corporations that, of their own volition, for example, like Ayala Energy, have started doing their renewable. And then there are financial-only investors that move their capital from this kind to impact investing, right? All three, we are providing advice. We are giving them targets, which is why, unfortunately, the cost of these portfolios is going through the roof because everyone wants to buy one. We can, there can be only one winner. So there's still no substitute to actually building, and that's the third. Where are we deploying our capital? We're deploying it in these types of projects, in the technologies of tomorrow that will change. So we're not just tackling power generation, we're tackling the circular economy, we're tackling electronic vehicles. We are a lender to all the top 10 battery makers, EV battery makers in the world. 6 are in China, 3 are in Korea, 1 is in Japan. We are lenders to all. I think we are one of only 2 banks that are actually lenders to all 10. We are lenders to all of the lithium miners in the world. Lithium, as you know, is part of the battery equation. We are, I think, the largest lender to waste to energy in the world, and particularly in the Middle East. So we are doing our share, we feel. And if you look at the Philippine grid today, just to maybe close off the topic on a hopeful note, we're actually 50% renewable now. We couldn't say that 10 years ago. Do we still have a lot of fossil fuel, which are actually old and have high emissions? Yes, we do. And when we have built, and I don't think anyone denies that, when we have built enough secure energy, not just to address the current demand, but the future demand, those will be decommissioned. In Australia and in Indonesia, early decommissioning is now the flavor of the month. You take 10 years off a coal-fired power plant and close it 10 years early. Multilateral agencies, banks like ourselves, provide financing to, in a way, compensate the people who have lost 10 years worth of revenues so that they can be invest that in clean technology. So all of these things are happening in parallel. And I'm much more of an optimist than a pessimist. I'm still very hopeful that we are better off where we are now than even just 3 years ago.
We should end on a good note. And as you do a lot of advising in the bank, I wanted to know what your advice is on maybe Philippine art, because you're very interested, along with your wife Lou, on ASEAN art. Now that you've come back 6 months on, what are you seeing in the market? What are the names and which visual artists?
So one of our wife and I have had the privilege to build up a contemporary art collection. Yes, it's ASEAN, but the core is Filipino. About 50% are Philippine artists. And I'll come back to your first question. And we started in contemporary art for 3 reasons. One, the art of our parents' time, let's say the Manansalas, that was too expensive. The second, the best was already collected. They were either in museums or in premier collections in the Philippines. And the third is the artist is already gone. Mr. Vicente Manansala is no longer with us. Anita Magsaysay-Ho is no longer with us. But in contemporary art, you have the ability to have a relationship with the artist. And that is actually what has emerged, whether in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, in Thailand, we've become friends with many contemporary artists. And when you become friends, you get into their thinking and how they think. Then you become not really a collector anymore, but more like a thought follower, because their ideas are so amazing. So you asked me, in the Philippines, very interesting artist, an artistic couple, Alfredo and Isabel Aquilizan. They are actually part of the diaspora like me. They were teachers at the Makiling School of Fine Arts, and then they immigrated to Australia Adelaide. They made it their home. They've now returned after 19, 20 years. And their work, part of their work is cardboard. Why? They work with balikbayan boxes, which they then cut down into shapes like boats, shapes like planes, or their own self-portraits. Why? Why do they do that? It's about that Philippine journey. And they're using that very material that Filipinos take with them overseas or bring with them when they come home. That is so interesting to us. In fact, we have one of these works in our offices. You should visit us one of
I
these
should
days
indeed.
and see it. So Alfredo and Isabel Acalison is one of those artists, and they are widely collected by museums globally. So they are in the Tate Modern. They are in the collection of Google. They are in the collection of Facebook. So very, very respected couple. And then I would say last thing probably is don't sleep on new media, video, photography, especially video. A lot of our video artists, Martha Atienza is one. She is based out of Bantayan Island, south of Cebu. Her family is all seafarers, so a lot of her work is about the sea. And she made a very interesting work called Our Islands, which is basically a procession, a Santo Nino procession, but underwater. It was actually to talk about climate change as well, because the reef was totally destroyed where they're passing. But it also was a snapshot of Philippine culture, because you can see that in a procession, in a religious procession, but underwater. This work is actually uh, institutionally collected. The MoMA in New York has it. The Tate also has it, and it. I'm not at liberty to say, but it will be showcased in a very special way in New York very soon. So these are just two of the artists that I think people should be looking at.
Great. And so welcome home, home for
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I wish you well in your plan to build the nation from here, finally, after 28 years. Man.
Thank you. It's
Appreciate
great
the
to be
time.
home.
And catch us again next Thursday at 9 p.m. Philippine Standard Time on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I'm Cathy Yang. This is Thought Leaders.